Golobarenko. Since then, the conflict in Ukraine and Ukrainian developments to a large extent have been overshadowed in the Norwegian media by other events, the war in Syria, the refugee crisis. So we were therefore very happy to use this opportunity when a leading Ukraine specialist is in town to give him this opportunity to address you here at NUPI and remind us why Ukraine matters. Today's speaker hardly needs a presentation here. Most of you would probably be familiar with his writings, but to give a brief summary, James Sherr is an associate fellow and a former head of the Russia and Eurasia program at Chatham House. He's also a visiting fellow at Razumkov Center in Kyiv and a senior associate fellow at the Institute of Statecraft. For more than 20 years, he has advised the UK government, NATO, and the EU about developments in Russia and Ukraine. And for a number of years, he has also worked closely with Ukraine on defense and security sector reform. Among his long list of publications, which you will find more information about if you log into NUPI's website, I would like to particularly draw your attention to one of his latest publications, A War of Narratives and Arms, that appeared in the Russia Challenge report published by Chatham House in June this year. James Sherr will speak for some 30 minutes. Then we will have two prepared comments, and we will have also ample time for Q&A, some 45 minutes hopefully, for Q&A towards the end of this event. But now, without further ado, I would like to give the floor to James Sherr. Please.
Thank you for your kind. I presume I am all mic'd up now, yes? So you can hear me. Okay. Thank you for your very kind invitation. I believe this is my second appearance at NUPI, so it's a pleasure being back. I recognize everything. What is the problem?
Just checking.
Yeah.
As I said, when it comes to Ukraine, I'm informed. When it comes to technology, I'm an imbecile. Good. Briefly, Ukraine matters because what is happening there is about much more than Ukraine, and this is the one area that the Russian Federation and the West, this is one area where the Russian Federation and the West are in absolute agreement. The Russian state leadership does not disguise the fact that this conflict is not just about Ukraine, it is about the future of what is now openly portrayed as profoundly unjust, one-sided international order, which, and particularly European order, which is inimical to Russia's fundamental state interests. In twice this year, there have been high-ranking statements to the effect that we now face a choice between relearning the lessons of Yalta and returning to that world of genuine equality and respect between states, by which Russia means equality not of all states, but of great powers, or we run the risk of war. Warnings of this kind have been frequent and blunt and well substantiated. What was striking from the last meeting of the Valdai Club, which I attended last year, is that in Vladimir Putin's overall statement about the state of the world and and the post-Cold War order and its evolution and its injustices, he only mentioned the OSCE once in passing. He mentioned no part of the legal and treaty regime that was put in place with Russia's co-authorship in the years immediately following the end of the Cold War, a legal and treaty regime which, from a Western perspective, codifies the end of the Cold War and signifies its conclusion. So this is why, you know, this conflict is bigger than Ukraine. At the same time, even in 1992, our former British Prime Minister, John Major, said quite prophetically, and of course he was representing official thinking at the time as a whole, Ukraine is the pivot of the future security architecture in Europe. And he did not mean that Ukraine is what is happening in Ukraine is something positive or negative. What he meant simply is that what happens there is going to be of fundamental importance and will have a profound influence on what happens elsewhere. So I would say, first of all, what has happened since February 2014, codified in March with the so-called the incorporation of Crimea into Russia, has now demonstrated this. And I think this is, with all the differences that exist about this conflict, this is something that is understood across what I think we're still entitled to call the West. Okay. Now, it was suggested to me that it might be particularly useful if I devote at least half these remarks to Russia's perception and Russia's influence of Ukraine and what we loosely call the Russian factor. And one thing I think it's important to do anywhere is to try to distinguish, with all the overlaps, the Russia factor from the Putin factor. Too often policy is framed in terms of Vladimir Putin. This misses 2 points. There is a history, a tradition of thinking, certainly misses. The second is, even today, the issue is not Vladimir Putin. The issue is the system of power which has emerged under Vladimir Putin. And I think as long as that system of power is there, even if he is quietly or noisily moved aside, I think the problems we face are fundamentally similar. So let me try to disentangle these two elements. There are three old Russian expressions that explain a lot about general. The first is that the political spectrum about Ukraine. Moscow, good heavens, how could I now forget it? Moscow is the heart, St. Petersburg is the brain, and Kyiv is the mother of Russia. So the essence of the problem is that as historians define these things and misdefine these things with all these distortions, Kyiv in the Rus is the origin of both the Ukrainian state and Ukrainian state tradition and Ukrainian historical narratives and the Russian state and Russian state tradition. Now, if you're a Ukrainian historian, the Russian state has nothing to do with Kyiv in the Rus, it has to do with Muscovy. But from a Russian perspective, this is not so. So this is contested historical ground. This matters very, very much today because one thing that has occurred under Vladimir Putin is that, and by the way, Dmitry Medvedev played a very large part in this when he was president, was the transformation of history into, was a politicization of history and the use of history as a political tool in the so-called Ruski Mir, the Russian world, the world in which Russian culture and language have been profoundly influential as a whole. Okay. The second historical Russian expression that matters, let's see how much I'm losing my memory today, is, yes, «Самостоятельной Украины никогда не будет», which means effectively Ukraine will never be able to stand on its own, meaning without Russia. You hear constantly today across the spectrum, Ukraine can't live without Russia. Well, I think sort of a casual observation of what has happened in the last 2 years would lead you to the opposite conclusion, that Ukraine can't live with it. But this is, again, this is a very deep-seated view. It explains why those people around Yeltsin in the early 1990s, during the period which even in the mid-1990s, senior Russians were calling romantic, and idealistic, and childish. Even these people who were sincere liberals and Democrats believed you can sign up to all these OSCE codes and all these treaties and recognize the sovereign equality of states, but it wasn't really going to mean anything because these states, in particular Ukraine, would have no alternative but to define their independence in coordination with Russia. If you look at the foreign policy of the entire Yeltsin era, we fully accept Ukraine's independence, but Ukraine ought to be developing its approach to Europe and its approach to everything else in consultation, in coordination with Russia. And this is a very deeply rooted sentiment as well. And the third expression is that Russian democracy ends where the question of Ukraine begins. It's falsely attributed to the historian Vernadsky. I don't know where it came from, but it's had a lot of currency throughout the 20th century and even a bit before. What this alerts one to is that the internal political stance of Russian opinion, attitudes to Putin, attitudes to democracy, authoritarianism, these are one cluster of issues. They have no necessary relationship to how a set group of people think about Ukraine. And in the 90s, what was very striking was that one of the most principled anti-authoritarian parties that found Yeltsin too authoritarian, the party of Yavlinsky, Yabloko, at the same time thought Yeltsin was much too lenient when it came to dealing with Ukraine and other former states. Now, therefore, when Vladimir Putin says we and the Ukrainians are the same people, this is not an original thought. But I also have to say this sentiment does not go back to the beginning of time. Vladimir Putin is today invoking the creation of Novorossiya at the end of the 18th century by Catherine the Great. Well, I have to tell you that the wars that Catherine the Great fought, mainly against the Ottomans, in the late 18th century to control Ukraine's southern littoral, in these wars, these were not wars of liberation, these were wars of conquest, and at that time the Ukrainians were not seen as one and the same people. This whole theology, if you will, really took an ideological form and fell into place under the time of Alexander II. And that is also indicative of what I said a moment ago, because Alexander II, the great liberator and reformer, was adamant that his reforms should only apply in Russia, not apply in Ukraine, and that the Ukrainian language and its influence should be suppressed. It is certainly since then and at times before that you find any expression of Ukrainian national consciousness, or what Russians call nationalism, by which I mean the sentiment that we have an identity of our own, we have a course of our own, and it's up to us to determine this. Any Ukrainian national sentiment was seen as a threat, not only to Russia's external interests, but its internal interests. And there is then the fundamental point, please, which has never disappeared, that Russia is a country in which state and empire have never been, it's never been possible to draw a clear distinction between them. This is very different to a country like Britain or France, whose empires were overseas. And you say, okay, goodbye. Because internally they are nation states. You could say Britain with the Welsh and the Scots is a multinational state, but it's still different. And this is why very swiftly, as early as 1992, in the first foreign ministry report about Ukraine, the sentiment was really there that Russia cannot internally hold itself together if Ukraine is detached, and that keeping Ukraine connected is a fundamental, vital interest of Russia. All of this was said officially very early on. Okay, That's the background. I can elaborate, but there's no time. What Vladimir Putin is the product, what we have seen, what has emerged, is the product of two factors. And that sound in contradiction to one another, to the classic Western mind, which loves thinking in sort of either-or categories. It is, on the one hand, this policy that we see is the product of rising enhanced threat assessment, as the Kremlin views it, but also the product of a growing sense of self-confidence and awareness that Russia has usable power with which to achieve its objectives. The issue is not, and I had to have at very high levels in certain countries discussions about this. We all understand that Russia's GDP is, roughly 1/12 that of the Western countries put together. This is not the most relevant question. The question is what part of this is converted into usable power, and what part are you willing to convert into usable power and accept the trade-offs for doing so? Could I just remind everyone here that when Japan attacked the United States in Pearl Harbor, its GDP was 1/7 that of the United States. It imposed a 4-year war on the United States and the UK. Okay. Russia has usable power. Putin became aware of it. Putin has put his investment in all forms of usable power, including a lot of forms of power we regard as soft, and use them for hard purposes. But the rising threat assessment, in large part, and I'm greatly abridging here, I must, but in large part came from not a reevaluation of NATO, which was always seen in aggressive terms, even under Yeltsin, but a reassessment of the European Union. And may I just remind you, this conflict did not in any way arise over the question of Ukraine's relationship with NATO. When President Yanukovych came to office in 2010, one of his first steps was preemptively, not as a result of hard bargaining, preemptively, to declare Ukraine a non-bloc state and put a brutal end, I know how it was done, to most Ukraine-NATO cooperation, which just became pro forma. You had 2 offices in Kyiv where people were sitting on their hands. And this had no impact. At the same time, of course, he didn't even agree, he just offered a 25-year extension to the Russian basing rights of the Black Sea Fleet in Crimea. And what was the result of this? The result was not a gentler kind of policy. The result was a much tougher policy. And he even publicly protested. There was a public occasion, it was on television, when he said to Dmitry Medvedev, you can't keep asking this of us. There are limits. And Medvedev replied, "Это только начало." It's just the beginning. Okay. The issue was that over time, the Kremlin has understood, I think very rationally, this is not paranoia, that the EU represents a development model, a rules-based and rights-based mode of governance and of integration that is intrinsically threatening, or at least very much in contrast, exists in contrast to the model that was developed under Putin's Russia, which gradually became, in a more articulated, more institutionalized sense, a model of a patrimonial model based on patron-client relationships throughout the political system and society, where what you really see at every level is a merger between money and power, not on the basis of rules, except those set by those who hold ultimate power, but on the basis of connections. It is what Slava Inozemtsev has called a neo-feudal system. And as this EU system became more attractive in the East and was expanding, it was seen as an internal threat to the Russian model. And particularly after 2012, the re-election of Putin after 2012, where for the first time the new Russian middle class, which was in large part the creation of his first term in office, when there was this opposition. Since then, what has happened in Russia has been a drawing together of wagons, a further consolidation of the center of power, the exclusion of many of those who enjoyed influence in the early Putin years, the liberal economists from St. Petersburg, the old Moscow establishment, and so on. The standard discussion inside Moscow today is it 3, 4, or 5, or 7 people who have direct access to the president? It's very highly constrained and consolidated. So he has added this. Of course, he and his closest associates and all of the ones who make the key, nearly all the people who make key decisions on this issue, come from the former KGB, one form of it or another. And effectively, I would say, the methods of the KGB have become integral to the methods of the Russian state. And disinformation and info war have become one of the primary purposes of government inside Russia as well as outside Russia. And again, there's this you see more and more and more illustration of what Lenin said a long time ago, that the distinction between internal and external policy is nonsensical. Okay? Ukraine is as much about internal policy as external policy. When the West does things abroad that alarm Russia, like the intervention in Libya, they see the ultimate purpose of this as changing Russia internally through a white revolution. This started under the Kosovo conflict, by the way. Okay, I'm now moving on. Yeah, must. But now, to intersect this with Ukraine itself, I think I've got 10 minutes. The war that we have seen is, by the standards of a non-strategic thinking Western world, it looks very strategic and coherent. But much of it is the product of improvisation. Much of it is even the product of panic. And let me explain the panic. Viktor Yanukovych became under more and more pressure by the Kremlin not to sign the EU association agreement. What was public was, of course, the Russians extended benefits, loans, further energy discounts, and so on. Behind the scenes, very, very brutal pressure. There was research done about how to tear the economy apart, and all of this was shown to Yanukovych, who was made put to him in unmistakable terms, with particular emphasis on the groups of financial interests controlled by his so-called family with a capital F. And while the macroeconomic situation of Ukraine deteriorated and deteriorated and deteriorated, a lot of people, when Yanukovych was elected, said, oh, yes, he's going to be more authoritarian, but unlike Yushchenko, he's going to be incompetent. No, he was going to be competent. No, he had set up a regime that was extremely authoritarian and fundamentally incompetent, the most incompetent, and particularly at managing the economy of any we've seen. And by early December, where the Maidan had already started, and this was already going on, and it was already taking place, he finally gave in, and he signed away everything. And after he signed away everything, there was such jubilation that there were people even publicly saying to the media in the room from the Russian side, Ukraina nasha, Ukraine is ours. 2 months later, the guy is gone. 2 months later. And Russia has no influence there at all. Well, given who this man is and how he thinks, it's not just these people, this whole system and how it works, what would you do? And particularly if you factor into this the view, as I said, самостоятельной Украины никогда не будет. It's not Ukrainians who are doing this. It's not Ukrainians who created the Maidan. It's Western special services. This is, this is a reflection, as they see it, of an elaborate Western strategy which has been going on, and it's been described to me again and again for 25 years in Russia to, weaken Russia, isolate it, tear it apart. What did he do? He does what he did. He did what he does very well. He changed the game. He grabbed Crimea. Okay. thanks to a whole set of military methodology which had been quietly developed over the years, which experts knew about but governments didn't know about, so we were terribly surprised. We started talking about something called hybrid war, which is a Western term, and it's a new type of warfare, and it's not a new type of warfare. It's a very old type of Russian warfare in irregular context, in irregular conflicts, applied to a distinctly modern and postmodern environment. That's what it is. And our governments were surprised by it. But this did not come about because of a long-term plan. There were plans, as there always are, but the process of actually turning them into reality, making a political decision, I think I know exactly when that decision was taken. I think it was taken on 23rd of January. Yanukovych was still there. When I was warning, one public warning and also private briefings back in December, if Yanukovych falls, watch it, because I think it's, there's a high probability they will move into Crimea. I was told even by my closest allies, people who have no sentimental views about what's going on in Russia, that this was highly improbable. Maloverojatno. Okay. Russia has made a huge strategic miscalculation in Ukraine. I think this is now becoming clear. It's made this because its whole way of thinking about Ukraine is not PR, it's not Franyo, it's not propaganda, it's just. And there really is a strong belief, not just there, but particularly there, that people we have influenced, people who are Russian speakers, people whose culture is like ours, that they're loyal to us. They're ours, they're nashi. Okay? Now, I haven't talked about it very much. Probably disappointing you as someone you introduced as Ukraine specialist. But when I was initially working in the country in the 1990s, one of my friends put it brilliantly to me and just summed up genuine Ukrainian sentiment. He said, and he came from, he grew up in Mariupol, okay? And he said, we understand the Russians very well. They're very similar to us. There are differences, but at a personal level, we can deal with them quite comfortably. We know how to deal with them. But at a state level, when it comes to Russian policy and the Russian state, we do not trust them. We never will, and we do not want to be part of that. On the other hand, we understand that Poland has done more for us than any state in Europe. Poland is our greatest partner. They are very helpful to us, and at a personal level, we can't stand them. So, I mean, Ukrainians, and even ordinary Ukrainians, my friend is not so ordinary, but I mean, even ordinary Ukrainians that talk to taxi drivers, talk to hotel administrators, all the rest of it, they have no difficulty making a distinction that we naturally think of as very sophisticated between a sort of, a cultural identity and state identity. They have a strong, even before this started, a sense of state identity. You tell the average Ukrainian in Donetsk, I've given 3 lectures in that university, all in the Russian language. You tell them that you suggest to them that they're Russian, you get people very angry with you. Even though their view of what it is to be a Ukrainian is very different from the view of someone living in Chernobyl. Putin did not understand this at all. And I would say the following. Now, but also from the beginning, when this started in the East, when this insurgency started in the East, it did not start because he was really interested in territory or even really interested in grabbing Novorossiya. It started because he thought by presenting the real threat of this and by doing this, he would force Ukraine with Western acquiescence and under Western pressure to agree his terms, which were Ukraine's neutralization as Russia defines it, which is not just no NATO, it's also no EU. It basically means your foreign, defense, security, and strategic economic policy is coordinated with, meaning under control of Moscow. That's the objective now, that was the objective then. They didn't start fighting because they loved fighting. This was designed to achieve a political objective. But the calculation was very similar to what Hitler said about the Soviet Union when he attacked in June 1941. I'll kick in the front door and it will all fall down. Okay? And he thought, no, sit.
You know, can I just underscore the point?
Here we are almost 2 years into all of this. Not just 2 years of a very nasty insurgency, but 2 years in which also there have been 2 major Russian military offensives, including general-purpose Russian forces, heavy armament, and some of Russia's most advanced, digitalized, precision, high-technology weapons entering the field. And what do they control in Ukraine? Less than 5% of territory. Now, that in itself, I can multiply the list. That fact in itself should give the lie to the view, which is almost as prevalent in the West as it is in Russia, that Ukraine is a failed state. Ukraine, in many ways, is a limited, immature, and deficient democracy. In many ways, a deficient state. It is not a failed state by any stretch of the imagination. There are other reasons I say that as well, which I'm happy to elaborate. But the result of all this, and I think I'm now coming to my end, is that both because of what's happened on the ground in Ukraine, but also because of what the Western response has been, which is stronger than I expected it to be, that Russia, for the moment, has run into an obstacle. And there is now what there wasn't before, which is great caution about using further intensification of military means to achieve its political objectives. What they're now doing, which is, of course, far more comfortable to the West, is using political means to achieve their political objectives. And for them, the purpose of what we call the Minsk process, which has been amended recently by still unwritten accords in Paris, is to deliver their model through a form of constitutional reform in Ukraine that would neuter Ukraine and do this with a West blessing. If the main framers and protagonists of Western policy conclude that our fundamental interest is to stop fighting and stop the violence, then it is still very possible Russia will achieve its objectives. If they recall their original and fundamental stance that the goal of our policy must be to achieve certain political objectives, which is to preserve Ukraine as a fully sovereign and integrated state, then they will realize that such a trade-off will not represent a victory for us, it will represent a defeat. That is where we are at the moment. If I were to put this in Belarus's terms, I think we are where the West was at the end of 1942, when after the Battle of El Alamein, Winston Churchill said, "It's not the end, it's not the beginning of the end, it's the end of the beginning." And what he meant by that was, the war's turned, but in order to finish it, it will require enormous sacrifices from us, and we can still lose. And the West can still lose, Ukraine can still lose for internal reasons, and Russia is not well, but very much alive, and has made amendments, and is acting in a very purposeful way. So that is where we are. This whole situation is open and very much in motion and very dynamic. So let me leave it there. I think I spoke for 31 minutes. I hope that's fine with you. Thank you. I look forward to a good discussion.
Thank you very much for a very interesting and thoughtful presentation. I'm sure there will be many questions in the audience, but to kick off the debate, we'd like to invite our old colleague, Geir Flikke, Associate Professor at University of Oslo, and Senior Researcher here at NUPI, Julie Wilhelmsen, to give some initial comments. So, Geir, if you would take the floor.
Thank you so much for hosting James at this event at the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs, and thank you so much, James, for your speech. James is not only a Ukraine specialist, he's also a highly regarded Russian specialist, And I think the talk today has illustrated for us your ability to take elements of history and contemporize them and put them in perspective in international affairs today. So thank you very much for doing that for us with such brilliance and such insight. I actually had a prepared statement for this session today, and listening to you, then I sort of regard myself a bit irrelevant in this statement, but anyways, I'm going to run through it and make a couple of remarks of a more contemporary nature to your speech today. So my first assumption would be to say then once again that the crisis in Ukraine is what you could say a protracted and festering wound in Europe. It's also one of the most comprehensive crises in post-Cold War Europe, inasmuch as the trust that has been built up through the institutions over years now seems very reduced. And if this is how a pessimist would formulate the past 2 years of incidents in the midst of Europe, he would perhaps to some degree be correct and right about this, considering the fact that the order that was to be upheld by the OSCE has been broken so vigilantly and so visible for all to see. But on the other hand, I thought I'd also say that the Ukraine crisis may, and then keeping in mind your quotation, your Churchill quotation, that it is the end of the beginning, that it also may reinvigorate some of the principles of security that we know to be true on this continent, simply by means of illustration. What happens if we do not uphold these principles of security and institutionalized security in Europe? And that, again, is sort of this vigilant call to European institutions once more, whatever we believe they're capable of doing or not, to uphold these standards and to also talk in the spirit of these standards regarding Ukraine and also the situation in the eastern part of Ukraine. So even the EU may be convinced about the value of the core order that it upholds, as it were, and then be able to actually distribute these values in its near neighborhood. One of the particular instances or the particular features of the Ukraine crisis, and I think you also touched upon that, pointing again to the historical bridge of this being an old type of warfare that has been waged before, but now with new means of communication and more advanced means of communication, of course. This crisis illustrates that facts are not brought to the table to reveal how reality is composed, but to create realities that are no longer facts. I think this is one of the big lessons from this crisis, and a specific element in the Ukraine crisis, and one that also needs a long digestion by the West. We need to analyze it, we need to understand it. And this is probably ongoing as well. Some issues have been oversimplified, overplayed, and finally brought fuel to the crisis. And they're not rooted in realities, and I think I've said that many times. You stated in the recent article that the linguistic issue, a core component of Russia's casus belli, has been greatly oversimplified. End of quotation. The fact is that the Ukrainian state building has been embedded in the constitution. The constitution has been granting rights for Russian speakers. And also the citizen policy of Ukraine has been very liberal, very inclusive, and also non-discriminatory in any way. This is part of the modern Ukraine history, the 20 years history of Ukraine that we've seen as well. I think, again, and I've been very engaged in this conflict, that it was very appropriate of you to remind us once more that what actually sparked this was a proposal, trade agreement proposal from the European Union. And we need to get these facts right in order to understand that other issues were not at the table. And also, then again, to remind us of what you forcefully did remind us about, namely that Russia's priorities does not recognize the sovereign border of Ukraine. And it tries to influence upon Ukraine by all means. I had the pleasure of reading your paper in 2010 on the Kharkov Agreement, which vigilantly illustrated how this energy agreement was actually tightly coupled with security arrangements in the Black Sea Fleet, just as a combination of the soft power and by all means also the hard power issues. I think I'll leave my comments at that. My iPad says that the level of batteries is below 10%. That's not for me. Thank you so much for your speech.
Thank you. Thank you. Geir.
Okay, I need to put on my glasses. So, thank you again for your very eloquent and insightful presentation. I'm also in the situation that I actually didn't know what you were going to talk about, so my comments are actually probably addressing a bit different issues, but they take their cue from some of the op-eds you have written, which I just looked at yesterday. So I would first like to say that just for you to know, because you're in Norway, that your view in many ways dovetails with the view that you find in the Norwegian foreign policy and security establishment, if we take the general thrust of it. And what I would like to do is just to poke on some of the premises of the analysis of the crisis in Ukraine and try to take a kind of bird's view on the conflict, which I think is crucial. Although I totally agree, and I would like to state that very clearly, that the West and Ukraine are in their moral right in a sense, and that Ukraine is the victim of everything that has been going on. But I would like all the same to push us on how we understand the crisis, how we understand Russia, and the kind of advice we give for how to deal with Russia. And I would like to stress before I start that this kind of debate between more hardliners maybe and doves or whatever you want to call it is really important, because all of us who are working on Russia are actually fairly nervous about this big question. Who is Putin? You know, is he really Hitler? And is the project he is up to something like Germany at that time? And is he not? So this is just to stress that I'm also nervous about that. Therefore, also, I think these discussions are so important, and it's so important that we continue to poke in assertions and to maybe to disagree. And then the first point, which I wanted to kind of disagree in one of your premises, which I took from an article, namely that Western military support to Kyiv would force Russia to back down, and in more general, the presumption that if we're hard on Russia now, Russia will back down, and ultimately that is the right thing to do. Because I don't think it would. I think it would escalate the conflict. I think Russia would step on the pedal if there was, for example, a Western arming of Kyiv, because Russia fears Western encirclement of Russia, and we might call this a fake fear, something which has been pumped through the Russian propaganda system. But I'm afraid I think that it is kind of a real fear. And I also would judge Russia and Mr. Putin in the way that I'm sure that he will act on this fear and that he would not step down, because this is his worldview. And I say that also because my area of speciality is the Chechen War. And I don't think that he's a person who would, in the face of Western arming of Kyiv, step down. I think he would. I think he would confront, And I think what we would have would be a war which would be much worse than what we have already. And I think that Ukraine would be the victim. And then I would like to poke in another underlying premise, which I often seem to detect. And that is the premise that Russia, and let's say Putin's Russia, that Putin's Russia will continue to expand and expand if we are not hard on Russia. Now, I have no illusions about the brutality of Russian warfare. I have no illusions about the revival of Russian ambition to strengthen the state, to monopolize power in the Russian Federation, nor do I have any illusions about the ambition to secure Russian interests and even to dominate, the ambition to dominate the post-Soviet space. But I do not believe, or at least I think we should question, and I think I don't believe, that Russia has a set and insatiable imperialist agenda. And I think it's very dangerous for the West to act as if it does. Because I would say that even if I agree with you, and everybody agrees on that the Kremlin has become a closed arena for few people, there are still going on struggles within the Russian regime about what course to take, what kind of direction should Russia take, what kind of ambitions, for example, abroad, should Russia have. This is not a finished discussion. And secondly, I do not believe that what we do from the Western side doesn't matter. Mm-hmm. So this leads me to suggest, and I would like to have your opinion on that, that there is still some scope for negotiation and compromise. And I don't see how we can afford not to try out this line in and over Ukraine. And here I just have to stress that I am not a specialist on Ukraine, but I follow it kind of superficially. And with the benefit of hindsight, could one not argue that the fact that we have not stepped in, for example, to arm Ukraine and make it into a military confrontation, but rather from the European side have betted on helping Ukraine to stick to the European values and norms and working towards realizing the Minsk agreement, that this strategy isn't actually proving to work if we look at what's happening today. And then I'm also wondering whether we become so blinded by our anger with Russia that we sometimes dismiss what are maybe good suggestions just because they're suggested by Russia. And here I'm thinking about, and you must correct me if I'm wrong, but I just briefly looked at the election results from October, which actually suggests that, yes, Ukraine is a fairly regionalized country, maybe a divided country. I don't know across what lines, but you can tell us across what lines. And in this situation, is it such a bad idea that Ukraine has some kind of federal structure? Might it not be a good solution for Ukraine? Not because Russia dictated it, of course not because Russia dictated it, but because it might be a suitable and democratic order for Ukraine. So I think I will stop at that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Geir, and thank you, Julia. Would you like to respond now, or should we collect a couple of questions?
May I first respond? Because
Sure,
this was a very concise, articulate, well-structured critique. Please do not misinterpret me when I say the following. When it came to the first 3 points you made, had I made those points or believed them, I would have entirely supported your critique. I don't believe any of those three things. I have never compared Putin to Hitler.
do not object to doing so in principle.
There are areas where he might be similar and areas where he is extremely different. I was invited last year to contribute a chapter to a volume of essays about Russia on the premise that Russia was a neo-fascist state, and I said no, because I do not believe that Russia can be explained in that way, and fascism should not be used as a synonym for something which is ugly and unpleasant and disturbing. It is Russian state is Russian, number one. Number two, I have never said Western military support will force Russia to back down. I have never tried in any way to make military support of Ukraine the centerpiece of what Western policy ought to be. I have always said there needs to be a broad strategy for strengthening Ukraine, which involves political and economic elements, advice, and that even in the military sphere, what matters is to help Ukraine recover a lot of expertise it has lost in dealing with conflict which it has at the operational strategic level. And in that context, there are certain weapon systems that Ukraine does need. So it is like a subclause of what I think needs to be done. And I think that, a key reason why Russia has been forced to the negotiating table and has been forced in Paris to make concessions that it was not willing to consider in Minsk is precisely because the balance of forces has become less favorable, on the ground has been less favorable to Russia than in the past. So I think restraining an aggressor is intrinsically important. And the third point, I have never suggested Russia will continue to expand and expand. Russia has a set of finite political interests. The Russian state, I think even now, the leaders of the Russian state, they are very high risk takers, but they act according to a rational calculus of what is and is not possible. They have ceded and been forced to cede enormous ground to China and Central Asia. But they are operating on many, many fronts. There is no, I don't think there's much room for doubt that, as they say constantly, they are seeking a different order in Europe, and to that end they are using every single lever open to them which is safe, and that means supporting illiberal, anti-democratic constituencies in Western Europe, even in the UK if they could, although I don't think there's any evidence whatsoever of collaboration between UKIP and the Kremlin in the way there is, for example, between the Front National and the Kremlin. So I don't accept these views at all. My last point, if I may. Yes, Ukraine is a divided country, but so are all the others. The regional divisions in Ukraine are no greater than they are in Italy. There are 4 states in Europe, prosperous ones, in which there are homegrown separatist movements, including the United Kingdom. We almost lost Scotland this year. All of these separatists, all these divisions in all these countries, Belgium, Spain, Italy, the UK, they are domestic matters. The reason they stay domestic matters is that they are members of NATO and the EU. There is no great revisionist power seeking to exploit these internal matters and turn them into international problems. That is the key difference. I know you would disagree with that and have reasons for it, but in any case, that is my answer. And by the way, there has not been a single opinion poll of people living in eastern Ukraine that has suggested anything close to a majority in favor of separatism or even federalism. And when the Russians use the term federalism in Ukraine, they are using this term to mean something that it does not mean in any other country in the world. It means the reconstruction of a system that the Poles in the 18th century called liberum veto, which gives every part a complete veto over the whole. That's what they mean by it, and it certainly doesn't exist in the Russian Federation. Thanks. Anyway, you deserve to come back too, but this becomes a very long discussion.
Let
yes,
us
sorry.
open
okay.
for a question from the audience, and we may come back to
I
you.
just want to make sure that I didn't suggest federation in the way Russia said they would. I didn't say. I said precisely some kind of order which would incorporate the diversity of Ukraine to a greater extent might be a good thing for Ukraine, independent of what Russia says.
I fully agree, and let Ukrainians decide that themselves. Okay, I fully agree with you.
Okay, then we open the floor. You will have to use a mic, and you'll get that from Liv. And please introduce yourself before asking a question or giving your comment. And the first question is here. I think we'll take a couple of the time.
Yes, thank you. That was 60 minutes of undiluted fascination, I have to say. First, a quick comment down history lane, and then a main question. When you talked about Russian relations to Ukraine, it struck me, I've heard this line of argument before in the Middle East. You have the particular Israeli relations to the West Bank, Palestine, which of course are based on the long lines of history. We do not talk about the West Bank, we talk about Judea and Samaria, we talk about our history and in a way our country. So there's a certain line of parallel here, I think. Now my main question is, we talked about the possibilities of a kind of way out of this. And I do not refer in any way to a formal structured peace agreement. I do not talk about any kind of Vienna-type conference where all the lines are laid down. But I talk about rather an approach which will try to capture what would be elements of an informal agreement between the main parties or where to proceed. And then the line is, the way you look at the contract between Russia and the main Western partners now, how would you describe that level of contract? I do suppose contracts take place, the Minsk agreement and whatnot, but how would you describe the level of a contract and the level of confidence? And to follow up that question, do you see any possibilities, let's say, the main two partners of the Security Council, Russia and the USA, possibly through the informal way, could arrive at a possible informal agreement of where to go? Thank you.
Mm-hmm. And if you could please introduce yourself also.
Yes, my name is Rolf Berg, retired from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs.
Thank you. Thank you. The introduction.
One more question in the front here.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Wolfgang Biermann. I'm also retired. I've been working for Egon Bahr until the last months. I have a question more from a German perspective, of course. I have a question, what can or should the European Union or Europeans do? I mean, Germany, and I think in this debate, is many things are misinterpreted. For example, the question of sanctions. Steinmeier repeatedly says the sanctions are not made to back down the Russians, to get them on their knees. They are made to get time to avoid escalation of military conflict and get time to find a solution. That's the one thing. The other thing is that Germany had a very clear role in the beginning, as you know, when there was this agreement between the foreign ministers of France, Germany, and Poland, with an agreement how the way in Ukraine should do, which was basically agreed upon also by the opposition. And though I want to ask you just shortly what you remember of it. Why did the Ukraine, after the decline of the older president, not follow up that line, which I think could have been a different approach? But
could you just elaborate on that, because I'm...
No, you know, I think it was at 23rd of February or something like that, when Steinmeier, the French foreign minister, the Polish foreign minister, and a representative from Russia discussed with the different groups, with the president, and also with opposition groups from Maidan on this question of how in future, I mean, not the timetable is interesting, the question is of the inclusive, there was one word, should be an inclusive government. I mean, that's only, but I don't want to go on this in much, because I think the most problem is what what's also going wrong or could be done better from a European perspective. Because we have a Europe, I mean the European Union, which is quite splitted on that issue. You have those who suffered from Russia. You have those who are somehow interested, but not very much. And you have those which are the Germans somehow exclusively, which lived in two states which were part of that confrontation. And the question is how to find a solution. For example, in Germany there is a debate coming up, in particular also among conservatives and business life, etc., to find a way to have a more flexible approach to this question of sanctions. So to say, give incentives of reducing specific parts of sanctions to other things. But there is a very principal problem that that is the problem of unity of Europe. And then the question make it all fundamental. Either Ukraine gets the full control over its borders, or there will be continuation of sanctions. So there is little flexibility, but maybe you have an idea what kind of flexibility the West should develop to get a process which is starting a little bit, but get it better on. Thank you.
Yes, James?
Okay,
Yep.
should I?
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much. Very useful questions. First, yes, it's true. Let's go back to where, just remind me one word, one theme. I got so engrossed in this. One theme of what you had said, I don't want to forget it. No. Gentlemen, oh, it wasn't. It was, no, it wasn't you. It was, do you not have the first question? No. Oh, so this was it. And all right, I thought there were two questions. I'm sorry, I'm focusing. Okay. All right. Oh yes. Oh yes. It was from you and from you. I'm awfully sorry. Forgive me. Okay. First of all, you know, the history question was mentioned again. You rightly cited a parallel in a way more far-fetched, because you have to go back over a millennium to, you know, for these comparisons to become relevant. But if we now adopted as our principle that countries must be restored to their natural historical borders, well, we would end up with another 30 years war in Europe, and this would be exceptionally menacing. And what are historical borders? Putin talks about restoration of historical Russia. Well, the Russian Federation today comes close to historical Russia in 1560. Okay, does he mean 22nd June 1941? What does he mean exactly? There was an old understanding in the Soviet Union that anybody who has ever been born in a country that is part of the Soviet Union, was part of Russia, or will be part of Russia, is born in Russia. Okay, I think it means something like that. So you know, this is a principle that no European country can possibly accept. So I think you fully agree with me. What is the level of contact between Putin and his Western interlocutors? Exceptionally intensive. President Obama initiated some 30 phone calls with President Putin. You know what happened after a while? Putin said, "I refuse to take any more phone calls from that man." Angela Merkel has spoken to him privately, and she, of course, has met with him more than anyone else, face to face, and by phone, put it all together 30 to 40 times. So very, very high level of contact. But there was something that crept into the question, which I would like to question, which is because you talked about contact and confidence. There is no necessary connection between the two. It is the contact with President Putin that has reinforced Angela Merkel's view that the problem is very, very serious. And, you know, as she has said, amongst other things, this man has lied to me seriously on at least 4 occasions. So, you know, there's a difference between contact and confidence and agreement and narrowing differences. Thank you very much from, you know, both the EU and the German perspective. It's absolutely clear. One thing the Russians were not counting upon was Europe's unity. Now, I don't think I'm saying anything controversial, and saying terribly controversial, and saying if Angela Merkel did not understand this situation as clearly as she does, and if she weren't as strong as she is, I don't think that unity would be there. Okay, I think her authority, her moral authority, has been very impressive and absolutely instrumental in all of this. The particular question about, I know what you're talking about now. It is when, before the subgroups were established, the Western powers were directly getting involved in discussions with the so-called separatists in the East. This was not getting anywhere. It's not really going, I don't think it is going to get anywhere, because these people want something. Once you're able to clarify what you want, what they want, it's nothing that either Ukraine or the West can accept.
It was not the Eastern European, it was the opposition Maidan and
Oh, I now see what you were talking about. February 2014.
Yes.
Why did that fall apart? Oh, okay. That's why I was asking you to clarify. I wasn't quite sure what you were talking about. From what I understand directly from Radek Sikorski, it's not just what he told me, but he said it publicly later. During these negotiations, Yanukovych, who at that point one knows was terrified and was really, he had his back against the wall. At that point, he had already lost control. At that point, the Ukrainian security services were already directly under the control of Moscow. A lot of things were going on. Nevertheless, he was bargaining very hard and not budging. He then said, "Excuse me, I have to take a phone call from President Putin." He came back and his attitude changed. It's fairly plain that in the midst of this, Putin then decided to switch to Plan B. He said, fold everything up. He was already packed and ready to go. This was presented to the Maidan. We all saw this on television, and some of the de facto leaders of Maidan said, we absolutely accept it. In the middle of this discussion, really before anything happened, Yanukovych suddenly disappeared. Okay? The Berkut, the special militia forces of were already fleeing. They were already redeploying to Crimea and to points east. In fact, there's even shortly afterwards, there was a security company named Berkut that set itself up in Moscow with a lot of these people. So suddenly all this happened. There was a sense of immense surprise and shock. Suddenly the state, one day the state is there, the next day it's not there. There was no attempt at any point, no attempt to seize offices, nothing like this. It just mysteriously had gone. And Parliament then met to impeach him. And one of the principal legal arguments is that a president who has fled is no longer, by definition, a president. Okay, so that answers that. What can the EU do better? This is the main. This is the main issue. What the EU can do better is to continue doing what it is doing as long as it takes. That would be my answer. And there's only one thing I would say about the sanctions. And the Steinmeier quote you mentioned is very interesting because it comes close to saying what I would say. The part of the sanctions that really disturbs the Russians, the Kremlin, it's not the personal stuff. It's the fact that the sectors that constitute the center of their power now are denied access to finance. The state energy sector is deeply indebted. But more importantly, they're denied access to technology. It means all the new energy plans are off the shelf. Just after this happened, the head of Exxon in London said, all suspended. All our agreements with Rosneft suspended, off the shelf. Nothing will be done in the Arctic. Any new agreements you see signed are old technology, old fields, right? The second thing, thanks to the reforms in the Russian armed forces, there are some 800 weapon systems dependent to one degree or another on Western subcomponents. They can't get them anymore. That doesn't affect Russia's military capability today, but it has a cumulative impact. And then, of course, thanks to their own stupidity, now they completely cut off their relationship with the Ukrainian defense complex, which was almost organically part of theirs. The point I'm making is that some of this, I think, should not be thought of as a sanction. The technology aspects of it, I think, need to be thought of by us and redefined as a security measure to constrain Russia's capability as long as these policies are in place. And it's not these sanctions, the technology sanctions, that, by the way, have the principal impact on European economies. So in principle, it ought to be possible inside the West as a whole to have that discussion, but we need to have it because it's important to ensure if and when they want to do something like this again, it's much more difficult. That would be my answer, but mainly not lose patience. This is a long-term, we are dealing with a protracted long-term struggle here. And if you think that the point of this is just to punish Russia and then in 6 weeks or 6 months their behavior changes, well, you're doomed to disappointment.
Okay, we have a few more questions. You're next.
My name is Dagfinn Mork. I would like to draw your attention to...
Mic is on, is it?
Is it Brian?
Okay.
We're hearing you, though.
Okay, I'll start here. My name is Dag Finnmark. I would like to draw your attention to the people and where they are connected. It seems to me that when I speak to people in like Luhansk, they are more likely to go to Voronezh than to go west. If I speak with people in Kyiv, they would go to Belgorod. Just to give a couple of questions or observations. So, and if you look at the maps and what was, how to say, the border over time, it seems to me that there's a lot of people in eastern Ukraine who has a lot of connections, both business and most of all family-wise. That means that the border today is not a natural border to them. And you hardly see them, how to say, go to Vinnytsia, Lviv, or things like that. So I would very much like to hear your opinion. Do we have the right borders that we have today if you look at the people who actually live and work there? Thank you.
I think you answered your own question. They go to these places because they have family there. And I don't think one should read anything of political significance into this. There is some political meaning to this. It was interesting, of course, you go a little bit further west to Debaltseve, and you know about the major battle that took place there. Afterwards, by agreement, each side brought 15 buses to move people either further east or further west. The ones going further west, they all filled up, and the ones going further east were empty. There are certainly more IDPs displaced in Russia than in the other western parts of Ukraine. But for a very obvious reason, if there is a war, you don't flee into the fighting, you flee away from fighting. But there are strong family ties. This is well understood. But another part of this reality is that, of course, there are family ties elsewhere in Ukraine with Russians. There's so many families, so many people you can talk to who are reporting that communication with their Russian relations has becoming impossible. I don't mean for technical reasons. I mean they don't understand one another. Because the people living in Russia have a very different view of what is taking place in Ukraine and think that Russian speakers are threatened in some way. I have to say 70% of the Ukrainian forces fighting in the east are Russian-speaking people. Most of them are locals. Most of these battalions are locals. The Ukrainians who are underrepresented in this war are Western Ukrainians. So I've never said this is a kind of black and white situation. It's a subtle and complex situation. But the Russians have simplified it to a degree which has misled them and is in danger of misleading others. That's all I would say about it.
Borders are seldom perfect, but I think we have to stick to what we got.
But borders, borders are not designed on that basis. And anyway, sorry.
Thank you. My name is Kåre Hauge. I'm another retired Norwegian diplomat. I'm no expert on the Ukraine, but I did take the trouble of reading the operative paragraph of Minsk II. And to me, it seemed like a rather strange agreement in the sense that it sounded like a recipe for Russia to meddle in Ukrainian affairs on the basis of an international agreement. Now, what is your opinion of Minsk II, and where are we exactly with the so-called Minsk process? Thank you.
Thank you for your question. I won't disguise for you that I was not alone by any means. One of those who was very disturbed by what was in Minsk II. I've written some memorandums about it, happy to send them if they'd be of interest. But Minsk II, the first point to be made about it is that it was a product of a military offensive. So if someone says military tools don't solve anything, look at how this came about. I was in Kyiv when it happened, by accident because no one knew it was going to happen. There was a massive military offensive that actually, liquidated the Ukrainian forces around Debaltseve because the Russians had very sophisticated communications technology, Ukrainians did not. I think Angela Merkel at that point panicked. I was having dinner with someone at, 2 removes from Poroshenko, and he just got word that suddenly, without any warning, any notice, Merkel and Hollande were flying into Kyiv and landing, and then they had this 5-hour meeting, and then they went off and had a 5-hour meeting with Putin. And before this happened, there were a number of phone calls initiated by Putin to Angela Merkel. Now, we know already that he had already said to others, namely Barroso, if you keep this up, don't fool yourselves for a moment. We can escalate. We are a nuclear power, etc., etc. He said to Poroshenko, we can be in Warsaw in 2 days, and so on and so forth. This whole offensive took her and the West by surprise, and they negotiated very hard, and they ended up, I think, with a treaty which was very infirm and not possible to implement. Because the situation then developed, there was a refinement of this, I think 2 months ago now, in Paris, which is somewhat more implementable and which limits some of what you describe, which is Russia's potential to interfere, and which at least links issues in a certain way that provides Ukraine with greater reassurances over this process. But I think most people understand, the OSCE understands itself. It has formally stated on any number of occasions, you cannot conduct, it is impossible to conduct free elections under the barrel of a gun, under force of arms. This is why even if you had no evidence of the totally fraudulent nature of the Crimea referendum, it is ipso facto invalid because it is being conducted under an army of occupation. So I'm happy to send some of this in writing if you're interested, but thank you for the question.
Could I ask you to briefly elaborate a little bit on, you said it was more implementable.
Paris.
In what way?
It gets very intricate. The Minsk agreement mandated immediately a constitutional reform, of course, as a result of a negotiation that would provide special status to the areas under separatist control. Before Ukraine had regained control of the power of the border, and simultaneously with forces being withdrawn. And forces being withdrawn defined in a very precise way, which could mean at any point, because it says all foreign forces. It means at any point, the team of Canadian military advisors or the 50 British military advisors who are there, the Russians will say, well, you're in violation of Minsk, you have to leave. All foreign weapons, which means Ukraine as a sovereign state is not able to buy even, body armor from the Canadians or lorries and transports from Poland, okay? All these imprecisions. Now, what Paris has done is that it has delayed the creation, implementation of a regime of special status until after free and fair elections take place and their probity is certified by the OSCE. It requires transfer of the border to Ukraine before new governments are in place. It changes the sequence. It creates a clear sequence, and that makes things, from a Ukrainian perspective, somewhat better. And Putin was not very happy with a lot of this. He had a lot to say after Minsk, after Paris. He just left, talked to no one, got on his plane and went home. So, that's changed. But I'm happy, as I said, to send this, and it's hard to recall all the details because it's very intricate. You see, it's also interesting in Minsk, there was clearly no military advice in the Minsk Accords on the western side. On the Russian side there was, because at that point the principal concern was Mariupol. Mariupol, if it's to be taken, must in principle be taken from sea, but nothing is said about naval armament whatsoever. So the Russians could assemble an invading flotilla in the Sea of Azov, and they're not in violation of the Minsk Accords. Okay, there we are.
For specification, I have Julie on my list. Last chance to sign up for a question while Julie is posing her.
Thank you. I just wanted to, your comment on the sanctions regime, that it would not be enough to just punish Russia and then they would give up because it takes more to change their behavior. And if I understood you right, we're kind of in a fight and we need to do more to make them change their behavior. So what are the tools you suggest in this fight? If it should be a fight, I don't know. But what are the tools you suggest? Since you don't think the Minsk track is a good
Thanks.
option.
Absolutely, and Henry, yes.
Thank you, Helge. Good afternoon, James. Just a brief question. You said Ukraine is not a failed state, and I agree, but sometimes it makes a pretty good impersonation of it. We agree that Ukraine is the aggrieved party in this conflict, but we haven't dwelt much on its internal affairs. I'd just like to ask now, towards the very end, what is your prognosis? I mean, we're looking at a country with messy politics, on the brink of default, and with heavy oligarch dominance that they can't seem to be able to wash out of their hair. What is your prognosis for 2016 for Ukraine internally, James? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. First, Julia, essential questions. No, I don't think we're in a fight. I think what we are dealing with is a geopolitical and civilizational discord, and it is going to continue as long as these differences are there. I agree with something you said earlier, that there is some internal ferment taking place inside Russia. Of course, it's opaque. It doesn't mean it's not there. But part of what this involves, and it was stated by Primakov, who's before his death, who was a representative of the Moscow establishment, is some people questioning whether what is being done and the way it's being done any longer conforms to Russia's fundamental state interests. Okay, all that I could say is, as long as this policy, broadly speaking, and this hostility to the international order that was erected in the 90s lies at the basis and is the premise for Russian policy, we need a range of measures to diminish Russia's capacity, but also to protect our allies and ourselves. I don't think the main purpose of our policy, first of all, lest something else be misunderstood, I have never been in favor of a Western policy of regime change. I think Russia's democracy, its internal system, is Russia's business. I think we are very much at fault in lecturing to Russia about its internal affairs. If you think we might disagree on that, we don't. But I also think Ukraine's internal affairs are not Russia's business. That's the point. But Russia's internal affairs are Russia's business. What we need to do is make sure that whatever happens inside Russia, our allies are secure and protected, and our key partners are secure and protected. In other words, what I think we need in these new circumstances is a new form of containment using new mechanisms. And that's one reason, as you said, well, I don't like the term sanctions. There are a lot of the sanctions we put in place that should be absolutely eliminated if this particular conflict is settled, and that includes access to capital markets, that includes all sorts of things. But I think we need some restrictions now on military technology, as long as we're dealing with this kind of revisionist state. It goes without saying, the diplomatic track is exceptionally important. It must be working. It goes without saying that trade must be allowed to continue, and the human level things must be allowed to continue. But there are a range of containment involves political, economic, and military elements. And some of them are being put in place now, but I think that has to be rounded out. And it has to stay there as long as the problem is there. So That's Crimea is. It's like asking about Alsace-Lorraine. It's a longer-term thing. Crimea is also, you see, if you had the St. Petersburg economists back in, if you had people like Kudrin influential again, and then he's not influential now, they would start looking for a way out, because this is very costly to them. It's, you know, but no, I absolutely don't think we should make any concessions regarding Crimea. There are a package of sanctions in place. There's a de facto economic and political blockade of Crimea. It hurts, because the tourist industry is the principal industry, okay? But that's, you know, a bigger subject, very important. Henrik, I don't have time, because I know we have to stop, to elaborate the number of ways I think Ukraine is not a failed state, despite the obvious point you have made. If it were a failed state, it wouldn't be here now. The country in Ukraine is very strong. It's very sound. It's the country which saves it. It's the parallel state that saves Ukraine. I was in Kyiv in winter 2013. There was this enormous blizzard. And what was the name of that terrible mayor who Yanukovych put in place then? I forget his name now. And he has a big budget. He did absolutely nothing about it. What happened spontaneously is that ordinary people just organized the clearing of snow. They brought food and tea to old ladies. They did all this. That's what Ukraine does. That's what's going on in Mariupol. Little old ladies knitting together makeshift body armor for troops, all this. There is, you know, so this is one strong part of it. Another strong part of it is this is a country, unlike virtually all post-Soviet countries outside the Baltic states, where people have been able to take for granted fundamental democratic freedoms, speech, association, everything else. You go to any seminar at any level in Kyiv, and then you go to one in Moscow, even before any of this started, and my God, is there a difference in atmosphere. So, you know, there are a lot of things here. And people are outspoken, and they push back. But I think, you know, the economic situation is as bad as it looks, but it's also better than it looks. There is a lot of structural reform taking place. For 20 years, the principal drain on the Ukrainian state has been Naftogaz, the energy production and distribution company. It's being broken up. It was absorbing 7% of GDP. It's now only absorbing 1% of GDP. It's at risk of becoming profitable. Okay? There are some fundamental reforms taking place. They take time. There are a lot of things which should be changing which aren't. There are also some regressive steps. That is the mix. You talk to people that have no illusions about the people in power. They know how corrupt the prime minister is. They know how the machinery of corruption works. And they're still optimistic because they're saying, you know, there's a dynamic and a momentum and they can't stop it, and these are only transitional people. So I would, a longer answer is possible, but not at the moment.
I suppose that question from you deserves a separate seminar. But now I would like to thank you once again for taking time to come here, and hope to see you here soon again. Thank you very much.
Very much. Thank you for your warm welcome and your good questions and commentary. And how nice to be able to get out of this ghastly thing.
Yes. So,
application deadline today. So
oh God, what a nightmare. That's our joint curse.
Second, because Anila,